Welcome Exiles to the Mageblood Righteous Fire Elementalist. This is my attempt at making the best Righteous Fire build I have ever made. No easy task to complete, given in the past leagues we had access to full-blown harvest crafting. We had support gems that gave much greater damage multipliers than they do now, and we had cluster jewel notables like Wrapped in Flames and Burning Bright that used to give massive power compared to their now much weaker nerfed variants. This shouldn't be something remotely achievable, but yet this build finds a way thanks to one key element, the Mageblood. This belt alone heavily carries sustain and defensive elements like armor, evasion, curse immunity, which gives us a large amount of freedom to greatly lean into offensive passive choices like the Elementalist, an ascendancy I won't generally recommend for Righteous Fire because it typically has very bad sustain and survivability issues. Those blatant problems of Elementalist are nullified by the defensive power of Mageblood, which gives us freedom to embrace such a strong offensively leaning ascendancy like Elementalist. Unfortunately, Mageblood comes with an insane price tag due to its extremely high demand as a powerful item and its quite scarce rarity. Due to its insane price, this could never be a build that could reasonably be followed and has solely become a passion project of mine to see how far the item could take Righteous Fire. For that I am sorry, as I would typically prefer to make builds which are much more achievable gearing options, as well as including upgrade paths able to be taken to progress the characters as you go, and this character simply does not have that. Now for my overarching comparison between this current RF character and my previous Righteous Fire builds, I will be looking at three main factors most consider when choosing a build. I'm of course referring to single target, tankiness, and clear speed. The trifecta of elements that almost every League starter build recommended on YouTube you see the week before patch notes definitely has no doubts about it. Because nothing says reliable League starter like a clickbaity thumbnail and a build put out before the patch notes. Now first, when considering single target, I look at my Righteous Fire auto-bombing Chieftain from Harvest League. Thanks to Harvest, this character's gear was extremely good and allowed for some quite high damage numbers, but from my experience then, and rough memory on POB numbers, the Elementalist has beaten that build in single target. The Chieftain, I believe, had around 5 million DPS for RF single target, while the Elementalist here hits around 6 to 7 million depending if Convergence is active or not. So a rough increase of 20 to 40% more damage. Now second, when considering tankiness, the obvious comparison I should be making is to my original Aura Stacker RF Guardian, the Immortal Man from Delirium League. But given that character was built around completely busted, strong mechanics, I instead will compare to something more reasonable, such as my tanky RF Flamewall Chieftain from Heist League. Now this character's gear, in all fairness, was quite poor comparatively, but it still was probably one of my tankiest RF characters I've made to date, so that's the comparison I need to make here. The Chieftain was stronger against ground degens, no doubt about that in my mind. It has a slight edge against spell-based enemies, while the Elementalist has a significant lead when it comes to hit-based attacks. Overall, between the two, I would actually end up giving the Elementalist the edge for one simple reason. Simulacrum, one of the hardest endgame encounters, is loaded with attack-based enemies that would most certainly overwhelm the Chieftain, whereas the Elementalist's 90% evade chance heavily carries here and can showcase the disparity that layer of defense makes between the two builds. Now third, looking at clear speed, my mind goes straight to the Elementalist nuke build I made. This character had insane AoE coverage, decent movement speed, and the legacy elevated explode mod. The chain explosions were immaculate to say the least. Although I do think this build's current impulsive explosions are quite good, it's just never really had a chance at competing with that previous build, given that build's entire dedication was to girthy explosions and really nothing else. Our current setup has better movement speed, and the explosions will stay relevant in heavy delirium maps because there's a lot of damage scaling, whereas the previous build wouldn't have. I have to still give the edge to the Elementalist nuke build given how amazing those chain explosions felt previously, even if from a practical standpoint in most cases the current build would be better. When looking at previous Righteous Fire builds and comparing them to this one, overall the answer is yes, I do believe this character is objectively the best Righteous Fire build I have ever made. It has the best single target, arguably the best defenses, and close to the best clear. When comparing to Righteous Fire builds that specifically focused on these categories, this project was a massive undertaking for me and took a large amount of time and effort to grind out the gear min-maxing that I did. Even with how good this character is currently, I still see areas of improvement possible, like a 3-star Watcher's Eye, recrafting suffix or prefix pools on a few items, so on and so forth. Keep in mind, this is me defining it as the best RF character I have made based on objective power metrics, not the cost or effort required to assemble this character's gear. I still wholeheartedly recommend Righteous Fire Inquisitor as the go-to choice for somebody wanting to play Righteous Fire, as it works on low gear investment and has a great upgrade path in comparison to this character, which requires a Mageblood, and the cost is insane. Now finally, let's take some time to go in-game and review the current gear setup as well as the passive tree specs, etc. Welcome Exiles to the in-game overview portion of this video. Now, I'm going to keep it simple. I am just going to go over roughly what I did gear-wise. If I start going in depth, it's going to take a lot of time. I'll probably include a little bit of crafting steps in the POB for some of the gear, but I'm not going to go in depth as I do with other guides, because those other guides are meant to be guides, whereas this isn't really meant to be a guide because it's not super achievable. If you somehow have the currency to put this gear together, you'll have a rough idea of what to do, but I'm not going to go and give all the information and take all the time to do that, because I just don't feel like this is going to be very applicable to a lot of people. To start off with, Mageblood. Simple thing about Mageblood is it doesn't really matter where your flasks are. It's simply you have 4 magic utility flasks, and you can put them wherever you want in the 5 flask slots, because it's about leftmost. So even if they are on the right, they are still the leftmost of the 4 magic utility flasks you have. So positioning doesn't matter. That's the thing I'll say about Mageblood. As for suffix affixes, I think additional all-res is probably the best suffix affix you can get. It's crazy for how much gear alleviation it gives you. Things like reduced curse effect, getting curse immune from the belt slot feels amazing. Things like regen, obviously mandatory for us as a Righteous Fire character, but I think this is a great option for other builds as well for some extra sustain. And then, last but not least, we do movement speed on the suffix for the feels good, but I swap in % evasion rating when I'm doing something like a simulacrum for tankiness. Besides that, looking at other gear affixes or other gear pieces, we go for impulses. Technically, you could probably get smoother gear explosions from an elevated explode chest, but feasibly, to corrupt elevated explode chests 200 times, which is how many times you need to corrupt them on average to hit a +4 right for Righteous Fire, that's just not something you're reasonably going to be able to do. Hence, I go with impulses over a rare chest, because I could reliably get the damage from the +4 where I couldn't with a rare chest, because I don't have that kind of time. Impulses you can buy for 10C, takes 10 seconds. Rare and elevated explode chests cost multiple exalts and a lot of time. I'm not corrupting 200 of those. I don't have the sanity for that. I barely had it for Impulsa. Storm's Gift, this is necessary to make Impulsa's explosions chain. Impulsive explosions can't shock enemies. Storm's Gifts basically provides the element of shocking enemies to us, so that's why we're using Storm's Gift. Obviously, if you made a rare chest, 200 times corrupted them, you'd be able to use different gloves than this, and you'd get a new power level. But to do that, you'd have to torture yourself. Helmet. Objectively, one of the best ways to go with Righteous Fire is the multi-link RF helmet. I think now that you can get +4 chests are an option if we're going for min-maxing, and the fact Swift Affliction and Life Tap work as great damage supports, I'm starting to move away from the thought process of thinking that a multi-link RF helmet is the best choice. It is a great choice, and it kind of depends on your gearing whether or not it's what you should go for. Objectively, for this build, I think going for a elevated mana reservation efficiency and -res, I think, is the play. So that's what we went with here. And then for other options, we went for Fractured Scepters. These are the best in terms of how feasible they are to craft. Currently, I don't remember the cost of Fractured Scepters on the market. I think they're kind of ridiculously priced at this point. I don't even know. So that's something to consider, but if you want to go for min-max crafting, a Fracture on +1 all or +1 fire is the easiest to work with. There are other fractures like dot multi, % fire damage. You can still make some very good scepters. So those are things you want to look into, but it's basically about getting the prefixes first and then finishing the suffixes. I'll go over how I crafted this scepter, for example, in the POB. For the ring slot, I highly recommend going for a Fractured Flammability on hit. This is way cheaper than crafting a Warlord ring. The advantage of the Warlord ring is you could get a best in slot base like a Vermilion, or you could get a Opal ring, but there is that additional cost of your doing Essence of Delirium till you hit a good suffix. Then you need to annul off the bad suffix. Then you need to do Reforge Caster for a 1 in 4 at hitting flammability. There's a lot of extra steps that go in there that add a lot of cost to the craft. So I definitely recommend a Fractured Ring if you can get your hands on it for crafting purposes. And then we went for Fractured Dexterity. This is because I need Dexterity for things like Grace, for things like Awakened Swift Affliction. And then we, of course, crafted with Essence of Delirium. For boots, this is basically about getting a pair of boots with good suffixes. I usually just recommend buying one off the market and then crafting from there. I bought one with good suffixes, life regeneration rate being T1 for us, chaos res being great for us, and then another res also good for us. Then you do stuff like Crusader Orb, suffixes can't be changed, Reforge Fire, until you get good max fire res, Ashling, yada yada yada. I'll have that in the guided or in the POB as well. And then our amulet, probably the last item of gear I have to go over. This is all about awakening, orbing, +2 amulets together until you hit either good life, an open prefix, or you have to annul the third prefix. The idea is we're trying to get life in the prefix pool. So you have to have an open prefix, or you have to just outright hit life when you awaken or orbed it. If you have bad life, bad prefix, or etc., etc., you do prefixes can't be changed, reforge life more common. This is close to a 50% chance at getting like T4 or higher life on your prefix, and that's what I recommend doing. If you hit a bricked full prefix amulet, a lot of times you can sell the amulet back for the cost of the Awakener Orb, and that's what I did so I could have multiple tries at getting life on there. After which, you just do prefixes can't be changed, Reforge Fire more common until you hit something like Good Fire .multi, or .multi if you just randomly RNG into it, and then you can do things like Ashling to get +1 Frenzy, or some res, or some attributes. There's a lot of things you can get out of it. So, anyways, I believe that covers most of the gearing. Let's get into gem links. So, to start things off with Stormbrand. This is an insane amount of damage for us with Combustion, with Awaken Unbound Ailments. The way this works is, Elementalist, we ignite with Stormbrand because all damage ignites, and that allows Combustion to apply -10 res. Then we have Elementalist Shaper of Storms. It says whenever you hit hardest with lightning damage, you will always shock, and then that shock will have like 25% more effect. Then you add in things like Awaken Unbound Ailments, which gives us 69% effective non-damaging ailments, which is pretty huge, along with things like the 40% non-damaging ailment effect from here, 20% from this small node here. Between all of those things, all those factors, we get close to about 47% shocks on bosses, which is a huge damage multiplier. Shaper of Storms, one of the best damage nodes for Righteous Fire in the game, feels fantastic. For other jewels, we use Malevolence, we use Grace, we use Determination, and we have that all linked to Enlighten 4. This, between our mana reservation on our helmet and mana reservation we get on the tree here, and I believe, yeah, down here, we have a lot of mana reservation efficiency. It allows us to fit in powerful auras. These are basically used to get us good armor, good evasion, and then some nice little damage boosts from Malevolence. And then we also can fit in things like Defiance Banner and Purity of Fire. This is basically one of the ways we get to max fire res. We get max fire res from Prismatic Skin, from the small node here, from Barbarism. Then we get max res from Purity of Fire. We have Aura Effect. I think we get close to, I want to say, I'll just turn it on and off so I can see the difference it makes. If I turn off Purity of Fire, we go from fire res 83 versus, well, 88, and then we switch our gear and everything is equipped. Oh, it's because the levels from our scepters take us from Righteous Purity of Fire 21 to like 20. Basically, you have to get to Purity of Fire level 23 for it to give 5 max fire res, and then our Aura Effect gives us the rest of the way. So basically, we get a lot of max fire res from Purity of Fire, from these nodes here, and 1 max fire res from our Storm's Gift. Without that, we would be at 89 max fire res. It's just kind of a min-maxing thing. You can go for other synthesis implicits, but +1 max fire res is probably the best for min-maxing in your defenses. This works great with Tempered by War, taking 50% of lightning and cold damage as fire. With such a huge resistance to fire, plus a Ruby Flask, it just feels good. Other gem links, we have Withering Step, Phase Run, Molten Shell, and Increased Duration. So the idea behind these links are, While I'm on left click running around a map, I have phase run, which gives like 40% movement speed or something, and it just keeps re-triggering. If I get to a boss, I do Withering Step solely to inflict Wither for -6 all res from the belt enchant. Just a nice little bonus to damage. That's the reason we're doing Withering Step. I previously was using Smoke Mine here, just for basically swapping between Smoke Mine movement speed and phase run movement speed, etc. But for right now, it's basically just Withering Step whenever we're next to a boss for some extra damage. It also gives us phasing if phase run ever goes down. I think it has a small, like, split second of downtime, which you technically could feel. You could fill that with Withering Step, which also gives elusive for some avoidance to damage, which feels good as well. And then Molten Shell, whenever we're about to take some heavy boss damage or we're taking damage from monsters, we proc Molten Shell, and it's an extra 10k barrier of EHP. It allows us to tank things like the Meteor, but its limitations are we can't take the Maven memory game, we cannot tank, we're just a little bit shy of doing that. The Maven Brain Bomb, we can't tank that, that's a little too powerful for us. And Uber Zeri Double Flame Blast. We technically can tank one of those, but we cannot tank the double from my play testing. So that's our limitations on what we can tank. We can tank most things in the game, but there are a few things that hit just a little bit too hard for us. Next build will tank those things. That's the plan. I like making builds that can tank those things because it just feels good. You know, it's a superiority. You just got to tell the boss, hey, even your strongest attack can't hurt me. It feels good to say things like that. Anyways, then we have Enduring Cry and Flame Dash over here. Basically just Flame Dash is I need to jump over something like maybe Maven lasers or a rock or something. Flame Dash is there for whenever we need to move over something. And then Enduring Cry, not Molten Shell, is if we ever take damage, then we will recover life. Or you can proc it while you're mapping to keep endurance charges up. That's kind of up to you how you want to play it. But I usually just wait until I'm either going to proc Valrighteous Fire or I take damage, then I proc it for a quick heal along with popping my life flask, stuff like that. Other gems we use Divergent Life Tap with Infused Channeling with Scorching Ray. This is solely so we can generate Infusion and we can generate Life Tap. These are both buffs damage-wise to our Righteous Fire skill. As for other gems, our main thing left is our Righteous Fire. Now we're using Empower because we have a +1 socketed Corruption. This is the scenario where people always look at this and they're like, that's a +3, Lance, that's not a +4. But you have to look at it in terms of +1 socketed gem applies a level to both Righteous Fire, and it applies a level to Empower, which makes Empower give you another level, hence a +4. Technically, Empower is a bit more damage than Awakened increased AoE here, and maybe a little bit less AoE, I think is roughly my estimation, but that's the link we swapped it out for. And then we have things like Life Tap for damage. We have things like Awakened Burning damage support for damage, Righteous Fire, Awakened Ellie Focus, and Awakened Swift Affliction. I generally recommend Life Tap plus Awakened Swift Affliction. If you're going for a 6-link chest, it's 100% the play, and maybe even the play in a multi-link helmet. These damage links are fantastic. The only downside is the less duration to your skills, so it makes Valrighteous Fire, it lasts a little bit less time, but I still think it's 100% the play with how much damage you get out of Awakened Swift Affliction compared to other damage link supports, because Righteous Fire's damage link supports, they're pretty limited. I think it's 100% the play. You cannot use Swift Affliction without Life Tap support. You will see on our gem links, if we take out Life Tap, we no longer have Swift Affliction there. Once we put Life Tap back in, the green logo appears, it applies the duration tag. That's how that works. Okay, now, let's look at the passive tree. For the passive tree, it's pretty much about grabbing damage. Up here is insane amounts of damage in AoE for Righteous Fire between the Breath of Flames notable, the Acrimony notable, the Holy Fire, the Explosive Impact. Yes, in terms of we no longer have to path to Elemental Overload or Elemental Equilibrium. We save a little bit of passives there, and technically other builds on the other side of the tree feel a little bit better. But if you're playing Righteous Fire, there's just still so much power right here that I'm going to find myself on this side of the tree no matter what, pretty much anyways, all the time, unless I have really good clusters type of thing, and I can afford to not go over here. But anyways, Damage Life is what we grab over here. We grab Aura Effect, Damage Life, Divine Shield for some extra ES or extra ES sustain, which makes our net sustain better because it starts to negate some of the RF degen. And then we travel all the way over to this area, specifically because Prismatic Skin is so good, and then there's a lot of nice life notables, aura notables, all the arms, a lot of good stuff over here. And that's that's the gist of the tree. Trying to think if there's anything super important I should mention. Oh, Watcher's Eye mods. I didn't end up going for a dot multi Watcher's Eye. Technically, dot multi's Watcher's Eyes are still the best in slot damage. If I was min-maxing this build, I would probably end up getting a dot multi Watcher's Eye, like a 3-stat, but I didn't really want to spend the extra money for it, and I view percent chance to evade as an extremely strong stat. Speaking of percent chance to evade specifically, in the reference of this character I have here, if I was going for my tankiest setup, 90% evade chance, the difference with my evade chance from this duel and without it is 7% evade chance, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in the perspective of going from 83 to 90, and it could even go to 91 because this can roll up to 8% evade chance, that's close to the power level of blind in the previous setup, where it would make you evade twice as many things. And I view that as quite a strong stat, and I would 100% recommend it. If you're stacking evade chance, percent chance to evade is a very strong thing to get on your Watcher's Eye, because you need so much more evasion to start getting to 95% versus something like 80% evasion. This flat evade chance is insanely strong, in my opinion. So that's what we went for Watcher's Eye stat. Then looking at things like our rare jewels, it's all about getting Fractured Life and Reforge Fire more common from Harvest or Scorched Fossils, and your goal is to hit fire damage plus burning, or fire dot multi plus burning damage. Dot multi, like generic dot multi plus fire dot multi, could be good as well as suffixes. And then either a bad prefix or percent fire damage prefix. If you get a bad prefix on a Crimson Jewel specifically, you can do a remove non-defense, add defense, which on Crimson Jewel base, there's only one defensive mod. It's the prefix percent armor. So it has to take off a bad prefix. If you have Fractured Life, it'll take off the bad prefix and it'll force on percent armor, which I view percent armor as a better stat than percent fire damage for the amount of defenses it gives us. Just looking at like our armor, for example, if I were to take this off, that's close to 2.3k armor, pretty sizable. And I view that as better than 16% fire damage. To each their own. If you want to go for single target, then you just have to Scorch Fossil until you hit percent fire damage, percent burning damage, and fire down multi. So, anyways, that is the overview on most of the gear and the passives. And I'm forgetting, I should probably go over Cluster Jewels. Cluster Jewels, I recommend going for Burning Bright, Prismatic Heart, and something like Widespread Destruction, which will force these two notables onto the travel passives. I think super ultra min-maxing, you maybe go for a Master of Fire instead of Burning Bright or instead of Prismatic Heart. I'm not sure how that shakes out, but it could allow some freedom for a different medium cluster here, or maybe some freedom to go for a second large here, depending on how the passes work out. That's something I haven't 100% looked into, but that's something you can think about doing. And then Wrapped in Flame, Fan of Flames. Fan of Flames basically allows our ignites to prolif, which makes our explosion ignites chain better, as well as kill more monsters. If, say, you kill an enemy, that ignite prolifs, that prolif ignite will kind of stay there. And if it's Delirium, for example, more enemies might get spawned in and then killed by that prolif ignite. I don't know if that makes sense, but Fan of Flames, definitely recommended. Wrapped in Flames gives us chill immunity, as well as the ability to apply Ash on hit. So occasionally when we're fighting bosses, we'll get an extra 20% like more damage, close to it, not quite, maybe closer to 15% more damage when all of our damage increases are considered. But awesome damage there if your Stormbrand happens to proc it, and then chill immunity feels great. Other things, Student Decay. I just went with this one because I didn't have quite enough Chaos Res, and this helped me get Chaos Res capped. So, all in all, that's the gear, that's the passives, that's the character. Real quick, gonna cut this in the video because I forgot to go over it. Uber content. We have Uber Legion, Uber Blight, Uber Simulacrum, 30 Waves, etc. To start off with the Ravage Blight maps, these kind of just felt like regular Blight maps with extra steps because I had to anoint it more times. Nothing really special stood out there. To me, they just seemed like you set up your towers right and you'd win, nothing too crazy. Uber Legions. This basically felt like a regular 5-way. It didn't feel too much different, with the exception of the bosses got a little bit tankier each wave. So take that how you will. For me, I didn't notice much of an issue between doing regular Legion and 5 Unrelenting Legion. My one takeaway was those Legion, the special Unrelenting Legion stones or whatever, fragments, they seem to be being price fixed from what I can tell. It was very hard to buy one because there's basically 5 guys that had all the stones and they would not respond to your messages, so it just seemed like those were being price fixed. That's my takeaway, is eh. And then Simulacrums going to wave 30. This build, I did 4 Simulacrums with the current setup, all went and completed level wave 30 Simulacrum. I did 1 Deathless, and I think the other 3 times I died once. For Simulacrum, the moral of the story is you dodge Kosis projectile spell attack, and you're going to be able to do it Deathless. Pretty much what it is. Technically, if he does his Uber explosion thing, and there's other explosions around, and there's really dangerous mods, and you don't proc your Molten Shell, you could technically die to that as well. But for the most part, I just saved my Molten Shell for whenever he was proccing the explosion and just tanked it. And then Omniphobia, you basically can just face tank. Unless you stand right next to a wall and he does his burp or throw up a projectile attack, that thing can shotgun decently hard. So those are the main things you have to be careful of. Just basically Kosis projectile attacks, the Omniphobia throw-up attack if you're against a wall and then all the projectiles shotgun you, and then the explosion with really dangerous map mods if you don't Molten Shell. Other than that, it's basically about just keep moving, just keep moving. If you stand still, you will die. You can't stand still, unfortunately. When it comes to higher waves, a bunch of monsters all attacking you at once will kill you. So you have to keep moving, but overall, Simulacrums were pretty easy for this build. So that's my recap of the Uber content. Oh yeah, and Flawless Breachstones, I forgot about those. Those are easy from my experience, not an issue. Anyways, that's the Uber content, and it was all very doable. And I'll finish with the conclusion. See you guys there. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If I didn't finish going through the trailer of this character, it might have cut off before I got to showcase this character doing a release all bosses at once, the Feared. I will then play this. I'll play that for the closing for you guys to watch. Anyways, enjoy, take care, have a good one, Exiles. I will see you later.